This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
Prime Talk on Radio 786 100.4 FM. Assalamu alaikum, good evening and welcome. I'm Feiruz Nagia. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana's medium-term budget speech has left politicians, unions and experts with mixed reactions. Post-budget analysis echoed the call that there needs to be a complete overhaul of the structure of the budget. Otherwise, it risks South Africa's economic stability. Among the key points that were raised in the budget speech were challenges dealing with municipal debt, the extension of the social relief of distress grant, and government working on a new mechanism to attract financing from both the private sector and international institutions for large infrastructure projects. In this edition of Prime Talk, did Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana's mid-term budget speech address the crux of South Africa's financial issues? To discuss this, we are joined by Trevor Shaku, National Spokesperson for the South African Federation of Trade Unions, and Tshepo Kgadima, Economist and Energy Analyst. Welcome and good evening to the panel.
Good evening and thanks for having us.
Good evening and greetings to the listeners of Prime Talk on Radio 786.
And greetings to both of you. It's really a pleasure having both of you on our panel this evening. So let's start with whether this budget speech hit the right points. Trevor, we'll start with you and then we'll go on to Tshepo.
For Saftu, the medium-term budget policy statement did not hit the right chords. The reason for this is because there are a number of expectations we had going into the Mtbps, one of which is the expansion of the public service compensation bill. Now, we appreciate that they did add additional funding of 24 billion to cater for the wage agreement that was struck out of the PSCBC. But for us, the expansion of the public service compensation bill is not only limited to the increments of wages, but it is also to ensure that we expand the public service headcount so that you have more teachers, more nurses, more doctors, more correctional service officers, more police officers, more social workers, so that the public servant to population ratio shrinks, because at the current moment it is widening and it is compromising the quality of services that are offered in public institutions. In addition to this, we were disappointed by the fact that they are decrying the issue of debt, that the debt levels have gone so high, and therefore it is on that basis that they are administering fiscal consolidation, which in the remainder of the medium expenditure framework is going to be 21 billion, 60 billion, and 64 billion. And all of that, I think, constitute 69 billion. And all of that constitute 154 billion. And in addition to that, they are saying that there will be an implementation of the cost containment measures, which they had circulated to departments and provinces in August. And those cost containment measures are just going to worsen the conditions in the public service, because, as we have said then, halting procurement of new goods, halting procurement in new infrastructure projects, and freezing of posts is just a recipe for disaster. And this will continue to compromise public service for our people.
All right, Tshepo, over to you.
Thank you. Look, the medium-term budget policy statement obviously supposed to be a review following the last budget that was delivered in February. And at the midterm point, as we are now, we are getting a sense of really what the future looks like. And the future looks exceedingly bleak. And it looks bleak that now is common cause. We're all aware of that. But the tragic thing is that the state, and specifically Treasury, doesn't seem to have a tonic that can cure this terminal illness that we find ourselves really plagued by. What do I mean by that? I mean, when you look at the picture as painted, the GDP growth is projected to be 0.8% for the year 2023. And then for the year 2024-2025, you are looking at 1.4%. And we are at the midpoint in terms of the National Development Plan, the NDP, which had an august projection of at least 5 to 6% GDP growth. And there's no reflection in terms of either the budget or even the medium-term budget policy statement in terms of, why these GDP growth figures are not extrapolated and juxtaposed with the National Development Plan, and hence there's very little said in terms of what employment we are going to look at, because GDP growth is one, but you always have to also counterbalance that with the capacity and the ability to create jobs. So we've seen that they become wax lyrical about the growth that is experienced in the agricultural sector, in the tourism sector, and in the mining sector. But the issue is that we are not creating enough jobs at the right pace to be able to then ensure that the country doesn't have to have the burden of having to extend the so-called social relief grant of 350 rand, which doesn't even go anywhere, taking into account the inflationary environment that we find ourselves in, because core inflation is way above 12%, whereas the overall inflation might be said to be in line with what the Reserve Bank has been really projecting. But the core inflation is much more higher, which in turn means that the indigent, the poorer people, the unemployed, those that are reliant even on the 350 rand, have just become, now they live below the breadline. And if you can have a country such as ours, where 50% of the population is living below the breadline, is a big worry. And there hasn't been any talk about the macroeconomic policy reforms that are much needed. And I am astounded by the determination to continue to apply the failed theory of deficit financing. So on the one hand, I think they have chosen to mask the real blow of this policy of deficit financing, because they say, the debt to GDP ratio is around 4%. Well, actually, it is not, because they talk about fiscal consolidation. But let's look at what is in that fiscal consolidation. There is consolidation in the public good services, but little is done about the rising debt levels. Now, listeners would be horrified to know that Treasury is looking in the coming year to borrow 553 billion rand to service the ever-rising debt. So that means on a daily basis, they're going to be borrowing in excess of 1,536,111,111 rand. That is a horror story, because if that was money that was coming into the economy, so when they talk about fiscal consolidation and say the budget deficit is 4%, it is manageable. No, it is not manageable, because the interest costs are so much higher. I mean, in the current period in review, we are looking at 385 billion in interest costs. That means it's at least 1,057,000,000. And for a long time, I've always stated that this was a recipe for disaster. So when Minister Pravin Gordhan was the Minister of Finance, I said that South Africa was riding fast in a brakeless bus towards a cliff, and the minister was the driver. Now the driver's changed, but the route has not changed.
The policies
we are still
haven't
riding
changed.
fast in a brakeless bus, unfortunately.
Yeah. So Tshepo, what does this actually mean? So when we have a country that is falling into such debt, into this, spiraling into this debt? What impact does that have on the population when a country makes decisions like this?
Well, it means a number of things. In the first instance, that we continue to enslave future generations. Today, the debt per capita is 77,419 rand 35 cents. That means every man, woman, and child in this country, they now carry that debt of 77,000 and is going to rise. So what does it mean? It means therefore that we are going to have less and less towards public good services. The policing is going to continue to be under pressure. Education, the social housing, utilities, every of the services that we dearly need. And then there's going to be no investment by the state towards economic infrastructure. So hence you hear them now talk about tapping into the private sector. What does that mean? There's going to be no trains running. We're not going to be able to invest in the network industries, meaning trains, meaning ports, meaning water reticulation, electricity. So with that investment not coming through, the economy will therefore not be able to grow. And when the economy doesn't grow, jobs are not created. And when jobs are not created, and you sit with a situation where you don't even have money, enough funds. So we might have money to spend on the payroll in terms of police, education, but we don't really have money to spend on policing. We might have money for the personnel, and we don't even have money to spend in defense industries. So it is a very bleak picture. And unless we do something about the debt, to restructure the debt, because also the problem we have is that the debt that we have, I've always said that, temporal sins carry the promise of the punishment on the life year after. But financial sins are punishable in the present. And that is really what we are going through right now, that the ever-rising debt, we borrow that money that I've spoken about, but not even 1 rand comes into the economy. Therefore, it has got a knock-on effect instead of a multiplier effect. And that is just a cocktail, a lethal cocktail that is going to put this country into an even more precarious position than we've ever been, unfortunately.
Now, Trevor, I mean, obviously in that context, there must be a lot that trade unions will say or have to say about a budget going into this particular direction, when that flies in the face of what you opened with, when you said that there's already this decrease in the public, the budget that goes for public services. How would this then impact those particular goals? But more importantly, what are the trade unions proposing as an alternative? We need to also look at alternatives that are being proposed. Are the alternatives being proposed? What do the trade unions have to say about this?
Look, first of all, we differ with a number of points that Tshepo has made. The idea that the debt has spiraled out of control and that there's a bleak picture, we don't agree. Firstly, South Africa is a sovereign monetary country. And as a result, we have our central bank that issues the South African rand, that determines the policy rate. We have not accumulated debt that is denominated in foreign currencies so much. It is only $90.1 billion US. We, at the same time, also have a floating exchange regime. So in the context of this, what is debt? Now, debt which matters is debt that is denominated in foreign currency, because you are not the issuer of that particular currency, and therefore you will not be able to settle it at will. Whereas with a domestic denominated debt, you will be able to settle it. And the unfortunate part here is that there has been a narrative that has been drawn from the conventional methods and conventional frameworks of fiscal policy to record the issuance of bonds as debt on the Treasury's balance sheet. And this is problematic in a number of ways. One of which is that you cannot record the issuance of debt, the issuance of bond as debt, in our view, especially because those bonds in the first place are actually not issued to finance government spending, but they are issued to provide a risk-free asset for those who hoard wealth in society to be able to peg it safely there, because government bonds are risk-free assets. And as a result, your pension funds, your hedge funds, and many others who wants to store money in those assets, which can also have interest bearing, will be able to peg it there. So this is the first misnomer that has been said about the debt in the country. And a lot of the debt that you see is actually domestic denominated, which needs to be settled. And it does not even have to be settled through Treasury. It can be settled through the central bank, through a credit facility at the central bank to service that particular debt. You don't need to go into the markets to go borrow again and come and service that particular debt. This is the first point we want to make. The second point is that the South African Reserve Bank's bulletin for the third quarter of 2023 shows that the foreign debt has accumulated to 162 billion US dollars. And of that, 90.1 billion is denominated in foreign currency, in the US dollar and the European currencies, the pound and the euro. And 72 billion of that is denominated in the South African rands. Again, of the money that, of the domestic debt that is recorded on the balance sheet of the Treasury as a result of the issuance of debt, a lot of that, 30 billion, is actually on the balance sheet of the South African Reserve Bank, meaning the Reserve Bank, meaning the Treasury is owing meaning the Treasury is owing the South African Reserve Bank. And the question is, can a government entity owe another government entity? This is just a fallacy that is pushed to scaremonger our people. And one thing that Tshepo also refers to here is a question of the debt per capita. I mean, that thing is just a scaremongering category. It does not exist in real life. What do you mean by debt per capita? The debt that is accumulated by a government will never be shared by the people individually. Whatever you do, there is just a quantitative measure of how that debt, if distributed, could be per individual, but it will never be. So why do we even use it in the first place? It is to scaremonger the people so that they accept that government is in a fiscal crisis and therefore it has to administer three things. The first one is taxation, which we all, both on the individual side and even on the private side, we are rejecting them. Two, it is that it must go and borrow. We say you must not borrow because you're compromising the monetary sovereignty of the state. So they're only left with one option, and that is to cut expenditure on public goods and services, infrastructure, and other areas. Where we agree with Tshepo is that if you continue in this trajectory without inducing growth, you're going to experience serious problems. Now, where are these areas where growth has to be induced? In our view, the very expenditure that we are calling for on the jobs guarantee, on the infrastructure development, investment in state corporations, in our view, that is directly targeted at the induction or rather inducing of economic growth, because what you'll be doing there is to stimulate, first and foremost, if you were to invest, let's say, in the basic income grant that you are calling for, you will be stimulating demand. Why is there a necessity to stimulate demand at this current moment? Because the Statistics South Africa recorded that the 22.5% of the South African industry is underutilized. One of the causes at 10% of that underutilization of the manufacturing capacity is because of the declining demand that has declined by 10.5%. Now you have to induce demand to incentivize the holders of the means of production to expand their production. That's the first thing. But of course, that has a limitation because it does not automatically guarantee that these people will expand production once you induce aggregate demand. Therefore, government will have to have hawkish eyes and have regulations to ensure that these people do not just raise prices instead of expanding production. But the second thing is that if you are investing in infrastructure, if you're investing in state corporations, if you're investing in the jobs guarantee, you will be contributing to value creation in society. And value creation, as we know it, is recorded as GDP. Therefore, you'll be expanding the GDP. Now, the quantitative measure of the debt that is accumulated and the GDP will automatically, by growth of GDP, shrinks. You don't even have to be servicing that to draw the the debt levels to a lower margin in comparison to the GDP. So these are the things which, in our view, are problematic. And we need to also add here, because Tshepo mentioned multiplier. But if you look in history, especially the history of this country, you'll realize that fiscal contraction has never multiplied anything. Fiscal contraction, if we were to trace it, which I did, is that from 1998 to 2001, you have the public investment as measured through government general spending and public corporation spending declined by 24%, and there was a corresponding decline in the GDP. From 2003 to 2008, there was an increase in public investment in general government spending and public corporations, and in that particular period, there was a corresponding increase in the GDP. So every time there is a fiscal contraction, you have, as calculated by various economists, by the way, is that there might be the corresponding declines in the economy if you induce fiscal contraction. And the history of this country demonstrate that from 1997 until 2019, when COVID hit us in 2020, you'll realize that there is a corresponding growth or decline whenever there's fiscal contraction or fiscal expansion. And as Saftu were arguing that there must be fiscal expansion and the debt levels are not as high, the debt levels are actually not at crisis point at all, and therefore actually a lot of that debt is just government issuing bonds, and those bonds are recorded as debt on the balance sheet of the Treasury. But the question that the public and the audience must ask themselves is, why would the monopoly issuer of a currency go to the secondary market, to the third party, to the fourth party, to the fifth party to borrow the South African rand? If you are the issuer of the South African rand, why do you go into third party markets to borrow the South African rand? It really doesn't make sense. And this is our view, that this should not be recorded on the balance sheet of Treasury as debt, because it is just inducing fiscal austerity on the basis of the history that is built on that debt.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, Tshepo, just to touch on this, just very briefly, on the points that were disagreed with, if there's any points of clarity that you need to make. But I'd also like you to focus on this whole idea about fiscal expansion. Just for a layperson to understand as well. I mean, if we look at the fact that inflation is as high as it is there nothing government can do about it? Because, I mean, for the layman, it would mean that if you have less inflation, obviously people have more resources to plow back into the economy. So is there a focus on that in particular? Because we mentioned issues like the COVID grant the relief grant being extended, but it amounts to nothing with inflationary impacts. So it seems to be, there's lots of countervailing factors at play in the economy. Did the budget address this enough to ensure that there is prosperity at the end of the tunnel? Tshepo?
Yeah. Look, I can tell you that is a disaster. The government right now does not have 385 billion rand. That's what the minister told us today. 385 billion rand. They have financialized the economy. So yes, ideally, the issuer of the currency, which is the South African Reserve Bank, is the one that should have been the participant in the bond issuances. So, for example, we do not have the tool of doing what used to be called quantitative easing, which we saw being practiced in the US, in Europe, particularly in countries like Germany and the UK. And of course, that theory of quantitative easing originates from Japan. We don't have that because we wrote the law as South Africa. So the Reserve Bank Act is overdue for amendments so that, among other things, you can do what my fellow panelist is suggesting there in terms of the Reserve Bank itself as the issuer of the currency can therefore be able to do that which is called quantitative easing. So right now, if you look at, it is a lot more easier to buy a government bond than to invest in the productive sectors of the economy, for a simple reason that, well, if you can earn 12%, and government debt right now, I think, is about 9%. If you can earn that, why on earth would you go and have the trouble of wanting to invest in the productive sectors of the economy and have all the trouble that goes with that, including the risks? So that's really where we are sitting with. We have to undo the issue of debt. And when it comes to what are some of the practicable proposals, particularly to give effect to what my colleague is suggesting there, outside or short of a amendment which is timely of the South African Reserve Bank Act, it is not possible to do any of those. So whether the debt is in rands or is foreign currency denominated is immaterial. And secondly, the interest rate is so high that if you can have a currency issuer that can set interest rates so high and ensure that privateers, out of franchise and the interest rate that they do, you sit with the problem that we sit with, where the economy is just not going to be able to grow. If you are projecting 1.4% growth, when the population growth is much higher, and it's a vicious cycle that unfortunately right now we don't have, or there were no practicable measures that were advanced in the medium-term budget policy statement to say, how do we ensure that this economy grows, but it's not just in terms of GDP growth. Now, the period that we can look back in terms of 2001, and 2001 is very interesting, by the way, because at that time, we were told by the then Minister of Finance, Trevor Manuel, that effectively we had paid off the debt that we had owed or we had inherited when we became a democratic republic in 1994. But that was not the case, because what actually we did, that's when we saw the introduction of this theory of deficit financing, and where we have got this short-term 10-year bonds that have been issued but rolled over, because every time that they have to be redeemed, we don't have the means of redeeming. Now, if our debt is sitting at 4.8 trillion rand, that is a reality. It's not just something that we are imagining. We've got 4.8 trillion rand debt. The interest rate is 385 billion. The question is, how did we get there, and why are we going to projecting 5.2 trillion and then 6 trillion by the year 2026? Is because of rollovers. We have never been able to redeem the bonds. We are refinancing them over and over, but at higher interest rates, because every time that we have been downgraded by the ratings agencies, the ratings agencies downgraded us out of mischief in order to increase the interest costs, so that those holders of the South African debt, of the bonds, whether in domestic, rand denominated or foreign currency denominated, it doesn't matter. It has had an effect, a direct effect of increasing our interest costs and our incapacity, because the economy has not been able to grow. We have not been able to generate enough tax revenues to be able then to ensure that we can service this debt. So we've had to refinance it, so roll over and refinance, and hence of the 4.8 trillion, the question that must be asked is, how much of that actually has accrued into this economy? And I dare say to you that zero has accrued. Even when it increases to 5.2 trillion, not 1 rand goes into the productive sectors of the economy. Now, will the private sector invest in the productive sectors of the economy, infrastructure? I can bet you today, as I did in 2016, we're not going to see that, and it is not going to happen. And hence today we can have a Transnet that has lost more than 25 million tons of coal exports, and I think in excess of 10 million tons of iron ore exports, and general cargo that Transnet, which is the backbone of the economy, was able to carry. They have lost cargo volumes in excess of 50 million tons. Now, when you look at Eskom, on the other hand, the fact that the sales are continuing to decline and at the same time electricity is not available, it then tells you a much more real story that here the economy is not going to be able to grow, and there has not been any investment going into this critical sectors or productive sectors of the economy, particularly economic infrastructure. And on social infrastructure, we are also performing very poorly. And as a result, when we are in a pedestrian GDP growth as we are, and not in a position to create the jobs at the rate that we need to create those jobs, and at the same time we continue to borrow, it is a disaster.
But Tshepo, so what should government be doing? Because if they are doing the same things over and over again, and it's having South Africa spiral into this cesspool of debt, what should they be doing instead? And on that issue of investment, there was also statements that the government will be working hard to attract financing from the private sector and international institutions for large infrastructure projects. Now, we also need to refer, do we have any kind of light being shone through from the BRICS coalition, for example, because that's also emphasizing infrastructure projects? What does that mean? But also, what does it mean importantly in light of our weak control systems, to prevent mismanagement and corruption, etc.? Is there any funds being dedicated to actually strengthening that kind of infrastructure, that promotes the rule of law, the King codes, for example? Are we seeing government investing in that, which will perhaps increase our chances at just making better with what we have, or doing better with what we have in terms of the money that we have available to the state? Can we start with Trevor, and then can we move to Tshepo on that one, please? Trevor?
Oh, I forgot to unmute. Look, we think that the premise of the arguments I've advanced in my second segment is upon which we think that government can be able to fund expenditure on public goods and services, investment in state corporations, and all of that. And the second thing is that if you accept the neoliberal premise that says government depends only on revenue collection and on borrowing in order to be able to spend, you have nowhere to go except to follow that argument logically to its conclusion. And that is to say, government that is growing, whenever there's a revenue expenditure mismatch, you have to close that either by raising taxes, borrowing, or cutting expenditure. So there's no way you are going to escape the fiscal methods that these people are applying at this current moment once you accept their premise. Now, we don't accept their premise. The second thing is that what Tshepo is saying is actually not true. And it's also not what I was referring to. What I was referring to is not a quantitative easing. Quantitative easing happens in open market operations when government decides to buy all its bonds and flood the interbank market with liquidity because it wants to target a certain interest rate in the interbank market. And that is used for rate targeting measure, as a rate targeting measure. It is not used, and it will never be used to fund fiscal expenditure. So that is not what I was saying. What I was saying here is that a credit facility can be set up by the South African Reserve Bank to smoke the whole of the so-called debt whenever it wants. And that can happen anytime. There is no limitation as to that. The second thing is that even if it were quantitative easing is not a problem here. We are part of the Basel Accord 3, and therefore, like any other central bank, we can always do that. There's no need to change the legislature and what. There's no part in the legislature in the South African Reserve Bank Act that is prohibiting the South African Reserve Bank from performing the open market operations through quantitative easing. There's no such. So that is the third point. The fourth point is that if we accept the logic that Tshepo is advancing today, that indeed we need to service that. Of course, we need to service it, but in the context of the methods that this Treasury has adopted, which is, I've already explained, premised on correction of tax borrowing, and as a result, they feel that the settlement of such particular debt has to come from the balance sheet of the Treasury. Of course, it will be seen as a serious problem. We are saying it's not a serious problem on the basis of what I've said. The fifth thing on that is that if you have the National Treasury saying to you that we cannot do this because we've accumulated this much debt, and therefore the deficit spending is problematic, we think that argument is very problematic on its own, because deficit spending, and I've said this, no one can actually come and refute this argument because it's factual and historical. The South African history since 1994 shows that every time there's fiscal contraction, there is a corresponding decline in the GDP. And therefore, it shows that deficit spending, which is expansionary method of fiscal expenditure, is leading to an economic growth. And on the other side, surplus spending, whenever you try to save, you are going to have a corresponding decline in the GDP. And this is proven through 4 historical periods of expenditure in this country. 3 years of decline, followed by 4 years to 5 years of expansion, followed by 4 years of decline, followed by 4 years of extra decline. And this shows us throughout this period that declines in expenditure on the part of government, that is, if you are trying to save and therefore are not willing to finance through deficit, you are also going to experience the corresponding declines in the economy. So these arguments, I really do not understand them, because unfortunately, our economists are just echoing what Treasury is saying. Now, he says they met Treasury. We also met Treasury as Labour. I put the very arguments I'm repeating here, I put to them, and they couldn't even come out of that. What Minister Godongwane said in response to me was to say, no, Comrade Trevor, we must have a targeted spending. And I said to him, yes, I agree. We shouldn't just spend haphazardly. We must have targeted spending. And the areas of spending where we should target should and ought to be where we are going to stimulate economic growth, because economic growth will by necessity automatically shrink the debt to GDP ratio level,
so
and
Trevor,
therefore will solve our problem.
So Trevor, what is your view on the budget that was held? Was it a well-balanced budget? Do you feel that aside from the public wage spending or the public sector spending, did they get it right? Or are they getting it right, in your view? And then I'd like Tshepo to comment on that holistically as well before we round up the program.
Thanks. No, I think, like I said, generally, we are dissatisfied with a number of areas. We are satisfied with a number of areas, including the fact that they want to prioritize the blended financing. That is to say, they want to bring, especially infrastructure development, including infrastructure development in energy generation. They are going ahead with PPP models, which in our view are merely about socializing the risks and costs whilst privatizing the profits. And we've seen this with a number of projects that already are under that model. And in this instance, remember, it is Treasury again that is going to hold the guarantees on its balance sheet. It is already doing that. 179 billion is used to guarantee the independent power producers as we speak. Now they're telling us that they want to attract private investors, and these private investors, unfortunately, are no longer willing to risk. And we were told all along that entrepreneurship and business creativity and innovation is about risk-taking. But these people are not willing to take risks. They want government to de-risk their investments. This is the first part. The second part of this is that we think that the bailing out of Transnet, or rather, and we should not even call it a bailout. The investment in Transnet and Eskom should not be referred as bailouts. This terminology is dangerous because what it does is to imbue in the audience and the public the idea that this investment in Eskom to assist it is actually problematic because it is a bailout, and therefore people already formulate a negative view towards it. It appears as a burden on the fiscals, and it is not a burden. If you are having a business, just even in the private sector, when they have business and they want to expand, they go and invest. They do not say it's a bailout. They say it's an investment. Even if it is undergoing certain problems, they say it's an investment. They're not saying it's a bailout. Now, why is government investment in its own state corporations bailout? We have a problem.
I think perhaps Trevor, it's when you have an entity that is in trouble, and it has not been able to get itself out, and perhaps it's viewed in that. But I'd like to go on to Tshepo. Tshepo, your view on, what you've said initially, that it seems like, the future looks bleak when one looks at this budget. Can you sum up for us what you feel is not working by the proposals and what is possibly looking at holding more promise when we go forward overall? Thanks, Tshepo.
Look, come February 2024, when the budget is delivered, we are going to have a real sense of the pain that has been exerted to the economy. So if we look at, the review in terms of the medium-term budget policy statement, it doesn't look good. It is not appropriate for our needs. It is not going to offer us a tonic to be able to grow this economy at the rate that we need to be growing it at. In terms of fiscal consolidation, yes, I agree. Fiscal consolidation or contraction effectively say, look, we living beyond our means, and the areas where they're going to be cutting spending. I think there was that letter that earlier this year, or a circular that went out to say, come April 2024, there's going to be no new procurement that is actually done. When you look at the situation in terms of how they're approaching resolving power crisis in the country, the investment from the private sector, it is not appropriate, it is not effective. The guarantees, by the way, are in excess of 300 billion rand now that have been given to the privateers. So I agree with my colleague there that effectively here you socialize the losses and you privatize the cash flows. And those cash flows at the end of the day are at such a rate of return for the privateers that it is easy money for them. So our expenditure that we're going to, rather investment that we are told they will be trying to encourage, whether it's in the energy sector, it is not going to make us energy secure as a nation. But if anything is going to effectively be a leakage in terms of the capital that has to be paid. I just give you a simple example. Eskom yesterday released its financial statements. They purport to have acquired 17,000 gigawatt hours of electricity from renewable independent power producers. But in the same breath, they speak about 23,000 gigawatt hours of electricity that they lost because all the renewable energy is not usable at all. So the question is, if you are spending more money and giving these guarantees to de-risk or make it a risk-free investment for the privateers, it becomes easy money for them. Is it appropriate for the economy? Is it going to help us to grow? Absolutely not. It's not going to help us to grow. On the other hand, what options do we have? We need to restructure the debt. We need to ensure that the debt actually is restructured to be in a low interest environment. Right now, the interest that we pay on our debt is too high. Will the new development bank be within the BRICS context be a solution? The answer is a categorical no, because the new development bank itself, its balance sheet is smaller than even the Brazilian development bank, which is a member state of the BRICS. So it is not going to be sufficient. Will the other, like the likes of the World Bank, be a solution? The answer is a categorical no. There won't be a solution for us. Will the Reserve Bank be able to intervene? No, the Reserve Bank cannot intervene. As much as my colleague wants to say that there's nothing in law that stops the Reserve Bank from actually directly investing in state institutions that are tasked with economic infrastructure investments, the answer is that no, they will not be able to do that, for the simple reason that the governance of the Reserve Bank right now, that requires a 15 vote, meaning the entire board of the Reserve Bank must vote to do that which my colleague is suggesting. And hence I'm saying, unless you go and re-look at those sections that, of the Reserve Bank Act, which make it impossible for the Reserve Bank to be able to intervene in the manner that it should, to ensure that, therefore, they're not only looking at inflation using the tool of interest rate to bring down inflation, but that also they should be tasked with economic growth. And right now, they are not able to bring about economic growth because of the governance structure of the Reserve Bank. And hence I'm saying you have to really have a wholesale macroeconomic policy reforms. And what are the pillars of macroeconomic policy? It is the monetary policy. So the monetary policy of this country, it is not appropriate, it is not effective. You also have to look at the fiscal policy. The fiscal policy also is not, when you've been practicing deficit financing at the rate that we have, where I say, right now, there's a leakage of 385 billion that could have gone into the economy. It has not gone into the economy, but it has gone to the privateers through interest payments. So the fiscal policy, which is another pillar of macroeconomic policy, it is long overdue, whereby we have to make the necessary changes. And of course, our industrial policy, we have deindustrialized. So even if you were to have a basic income grant, one of the challenges that we have here is that we have got a growing trade deficit, and at the same time we've deindustrialized this economy that we are making. We are a net importer of finished goods, which in turn means that we have exported our jobs, much more critical jobs, even basic jobs. We have exported them to foreign countries, China or Europe and any of that. And there doesn't even appear to have been an appreciation of what are the opportunities for us to be able to really, through reindustrialization of this economy, then become a net exporter, so that we deal with the issue of the perennial trade deficit, which we've been suffering with over 4 years.
But now, Tshepo, we've been hearing this also for a while. Does this budget speech, does the medium-term budget policy statement have any kind of indication that it has heeded exactly what you've said now, or not?
Not at all.
And I think that perhaps is one of the critical issues we might even grapple with many years to come if they do not get that story right. So, we, on that note, on that very bleak note, just to say thank you very much to Trevor Shaku, National Spokesperson for the South African Federation of Trade Unions, and also Tshepo Kgadima, Economist and Energy Analyst. Thank you to both of you to discuss the policy statement, and also just making us alive to some of the pitfalls and some of the things that should be done but clearly are not being done. We bid you all a good evening for the rest of the way, as much as can be had under the circumstances. But thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much.
And as I said, that was Trevor Shaku, National Spokesperson for the South African Federation of Trade Unions, and also Tshepo Kgadima, Economist and Energy Analyst. And that was it for Prime Talk on Radio 786 100.4 FM from producer Nurinisa Isaacs and myself, Feiruz Nagia, bidding you assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.